Okay, let's begin. This very first video will run over material we already have covered, but the purpose of this is to start here and link it towards make you aware of the kind of setup that you will see in your coursework in particular, but also more importantly to give you something to get your head around. In week 18, we also introduced the smart home and smart device. This is loosely connected to that, but you, I hope, can find this easy to adapt to help you work it out. So let's begin. Create a fresh project. Call it week 21 for the time being, and then say next, as we do normally. Just make sure the location was good. Let's get rid of all the comments so we have a nice simple screen in front of us, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so we have a main where we're going to write some code, but in this project here, week 21, we only have this. What I'm going to do is just drag that into the source packages and get rid of that week 21 folder. You don't have to do that. If you understand what I've done, then please feel free to do it. Just keeps your architecture simpler just to have it all together. Now, the material that I'm going to build is already exists in week 21 snippets. All of the code is, but what we're going to do is we're going to go through the process of building that code so you can understand how it works and what the reasoning is and the thinking behind it. Okay, so before we go any further, let's create our very first class. And what we're going to do is create, the very first thing we want to do, if we look at snippet 1, is we want to create a basic device. I've called it device 0. I want to create a device and I want to just output the string content of it just to check my constructor works. So that's what it says in snippet 1. That's where we'll start. But in order to do that, we need to create the class. So go to your default package, right click it, new Java class, and call it device 0. So what do I mean by device 0? Device 0 is the term I'm going to give to a generic or a general device of some kind. There's only two values associated with this device. Let's get rid of all of that. The first one is a string variable which is going to define its name, or allow me to put some text in, and I'm going to have a double. I could have had an integer which is going to give me a value. What do these values mean? Well, name could simply be the name or the type of device, just to make it easy when we return it. And the value, we're going to just pretend that the value, the double value, is going to give us, say, a location, for example, or it's going to give us a number value associated with that particular device. It could be its serial code. It doesn't matter what you want to interpret this as, but we just have two values, a name and a value. The question you might ask, bear with me a second, the question you might ask is, why have I just chosen a name and a value? It's a very common pattern that you find in programming, and it's easier for me to explain how we lead to one of these new concepts. So we have two member variables inside device 0. So while I'm talking, create the class, string name double, and then let's create a constructor. Constructors are public. They use the same name as the class. The easiest way and the fastest way is double click, Control C, double click, Control V, so you don't have to worry. We're going to pass it two values. Well, the first one will be device name. So let's just call it device name. And the second, in the snippets, we're going to call it device value. Now, in the snippets, you will notice a slightly different approach to how, and then we open the curly bracket, close the curly bracket. Okay, now what you'll notice in the snippet is that I have the name and the value, and I repeat that with the name of the get and the set. Now you have to understand that that's a way that we do it to simplify and to work in a different kind of approach. But you can also not do it in that way. And that's what we'll do in these videos. We will do this in a much more conventional way. Okay, so we've got a constructor. We take the internal member variable and we make it equal the parameter. Now here's another thought. You might see this in some of the snippets. When you have a member variable, you can use the word this dot. And when you use the word this and you're inside the class, it lets you it emphasizes the fact that that word name refers to the member variable. I'm just doing this just so you can see. So if I write this dot value, I'm saying that this class has a member variable called value, and I'm going to assign it the device value. It shouldn't be capital D, it should be lowercase. So let's just do that. Okay, so if you do see that notation, that's what it means. It's often useful if the parameter name is the same as the member variable, and it helps you clarify it. Because the names are different, we're not really worried about it in a particular way. So we've got a simple constructor. Okay, when you write a constructor, it's always a good idea to test it. So let's go straight away to our client and let's create the object. So if we call it D0 or device 0 or DVC0, create a new one of those, and we're going to pass it two pieces of information. The first was a string, so it's a name. So we'll call this a watch. Okay, for example, it's a name, it doesn't really matter. And we'll give it some number, and that number could be its, whatever we want to associate, its serial number, let's say, okay, for the sake of it. Let's just run that, and really what we expect to see over here is straightforward execution. That means that the constructor should have run, so it should have executed that piece of code. Okay, so next we need to create for each of these member variables a get and a set method, so let's do that. So we do public, we're going to do a set method. So a set method returns nothing generally, and we'll call it set name, and we pass it a string. I'm going to generally use the word value. No, I'm not, because that would just confuse it. You can look at the snippets and you'll notice a different approach. I'm going to use names that might make sense here. Okay, so set name simply does what that first line of the constructor does. And for those of you who have spotted it, that's a lot of white space. So let's get rid of all of that and let's pop that all on a single line. Okay, so I've popped that all onto a single line because it's just, interestingly enough, because that receives one value and assigns it, I can replace my line up here with the set name. So what I can do is I can just replace that, open a bracket, and that does the same thing. So inside my constructor, I can use my own set method. And I'm showing you that because you can see these interconnections. So let's get on. Let's do the same thing. Public void set value. Let's just write the empty one and then fill it in. So it's a double, and it's called, I tend to prefer double clicking and pasting, and then grabbing lines of code from elsewhere and not rewriting everything from scratch. So that does that. And equally so, we can also use the set value here in our constructor, as we have there. Okay, so we've got two set values and I use them inside the constructor. And let's use get, let's get our gets. So let's do public void get name, but it can't be a void because we are returning a value, right? So what the name, what type of data is it? It's a string, so it has to be public string because that's the return type. It doesn't receive any values and will just simply return the name member variable and what's inside it. Same thing for the second one. It's a double, It's the data type, and we're going to get the value, open close bracket, you're not giving it anything and you're just returning the value. Okay, and very finally, we're going to create a return type string and a method called toString. Doesn't receive anything. And what it would do is it will just return a string of this. Now, we've had several versions. The version in the snippet uses a variable called return. We'll just use a slightly different one. So we set up internally a variable. Let's call it return value, because that's what we're going to return, empty string. Then we take return value plus equals, because we're going to glue, and we have the name property where there's the heading for it, and that's the variable name, and I'm going to stick at the end of it a carriage return \n. I'm going to do the same things. I'll copy that same line once I've written it once, and just change. So the second line is going to be not name but value. Value. And we're going to just tidy these up in terms of length. So you notice that that and that are roughly the same length. That's just simply to make the presentation of it nice and simple. So there we go. We have a toString method, gets and sets, and two values. Constructor takes the two values. You can adapt this device for so many different things. So we've got two types of information, a name and a value. Let's just test it properly. Let's go back here. There we passed it. So let's also create a helper function inside our inside our testing client. So it's public static void print. You pass it a string, and then inside that you just have a system.out.println, and inside there you pass it the string variable which you pass in as a parameter. I do that because I can then use my helper function to say print, and then inside there the object is dvc0, hit dot, and there's a get name, there's a toString, there's a get value, there's a set name, set value. I want the toString, and then we can test it all works. So let's just run that. Oh no, we have an error of some kind. Not happy with that. What's the problem in here? It's a problem I see as a red line on my device. Let's have a quick look back. In my toString, I didn't actually put a return statement. Some of you might have noticed that while I was just whisking through it, now that it is returning and it's happy, it's got that line in. So let's just run it again and let's see if there's any other issues. No issues. There we go. That's what I passed in. Watch with that slightly odd number. Let's call it serial code, right? Let's just change it. Let's test it works. And there you go. It's working. We can see that it's the same as that. So this gives me the information that is currently being stored inside my device 0 when I turn it into an object, which I unfortunately call DVC 0. Okay, so that is essentially the very first step. You create a class and you test it in a client like this. So from our point of view, the only additional things you might want to do is you might want to do this, dvc0 dot, you might want to set the name, change the name. So why don't we change the name to a iWatch. To test that works, let's grab that print statement. Probably want to leave the original in there and put a new one down there after we run this. And what we expect is there's the watch. I've changed it with the set name to an iWatch, and there's its updated value. So you might want to get into doing something like this, where you simply help separate out the lines by a simple print statement like that. I used one in a in-class test, and you can see that that separates them out, so you can see. So I did in a previous one just have that line separator as a separate helper function. So let's just do that. Public static void line break. Okay, we'll just call it line, doesn't receive anything, and all it does is it runs the print helper function with that text. Means that I can put the word line in and I can just slot it in whenever I need it. Okay, as long as I know what it means. Makes my client code a lot simpler. There we go, and it all works. So at the end of the very first video, we have a simple object, a device 0, which contains some name and a value. The value could be anything at this stage. It could be, let's just fix it to its serial number. It could also represent its location. I've chosen in this example to have a string for the name and a double for the value. Of course, you could have done this in slightly different combinations. There's an object called a map, which instead of a name would have a key, and instead of the, well, it would have a value, but it might not be a double, could even be a string. There are different ways and combinations you can have this. It's a very useful concept for you to see. So what we're going to do is return, the last thing we're going to do, just return those. Now that I've just demonstrated those in the constructor, I'm just going to take the actual line of code and drop them back into there. I'm doing that because I suppose I'm doing that essentially because I want you to always illustrate alternative ways of doing stuff. You'll see the strengths and the weaknesses of those different approaches as you go through this material. So let's stop the very first video and get it coded to this level, then follow straight on with the second video where we're going to create an array of, which is going to manage an array of devices. So let's just stop.